Welcome back to Biblical Questions Answered, Episode 6. Today's question is, how should we interpret the creation account in Genesis 1? Well, to start with, there are four main views for how to interpret Genesis, at least as far as I'm aware. There could be others that I'm missing. The first, and they are the allegorical view, the day-age theory, the gap theory, and then the literal interpretation. So, the fully allegorical view is the idea that it doesn't mean anything at all, it's just symbolic, it's spiritual. Now, are there problems with that? Yes. Generally speaking, you would have to prove, one, that there's a disconnect between most people who say that they go from chapter 1 to chapter 11 is allegorical, and then they go on. The rest is history. Unless they just allegorize the whole thing, or they say the whole thing isn't historical. There are many problems with that. One of them would be you would have to believe that God is fine with having things in His Word that are inaccurate because they send the right message. Now, that may be a little bit harsh, but that's generally how that works. Now, they are right that there are allegories and that there is symbolic things in Genesis that we should take into consideration. But if you believe in God's sovereignty over history, you would expect that what really happens to have symbolic importance, especially something as important as the creation of the world, or, the first divine judgment on the entire world. Of course, there are going to be symbolic things, important symbols. That's how I should say it. So yes, I don't accept it because it's not really taking it seriously enough for me. Now, the day-age theory. The day-age theory is the second one, and it's the idea that, well, okay, yes, there are 6 periods of time, and they're, 6 individual periods of time. God makes things during these periods of time, but they're not literal days. They're symbolic days. They're just long periods of time. Now, if you believe that, you're going to have to get around, He makes light on day 1, but He doesn't make the planets, He doesn't make the sun and the moon and the stars until day 4. But He makes plants on day 3. Now, you could say, maybe the light came from God and that sustained the plants for that period of time, and that's okay. But then you have on day 5 sea life and birds and other animals that can fly made on day 5, and then all the other animals made on day 6. Now, can you believe that? Sure. Does that help with the problem of, dinosaurs and man living together is a problem? Well, no, because they're made in the same period. So, how long do you want that period to be is another question. The other problem, scripturally, of course, is that can the word translated day in most translations mean period of time? Yes, it could. It's usually just translated day. Although in English we use the word day as a period of time, in the same way, back in my day. Obviously, you're not talking about a 24-hour period. So, usually, you would look for context to tell you how you should translate it. If only there was some context in the first chapter of Genesis that could help us see if this should be translated day or not, like a passing of time, of cycles of some sort. Too bad they aren't there. Okay, moving on to gap theory. Gap theory is it's the theory I respect the most that I disagree with. Because at the very least, they accept everything else as history. Usually. Sometimes they don't. But a lot of them are like, oh yeah, everything else literally happened. Adam was the first man. Everything else was made in 6 days. I'm like, oh, interesting. I can sort of work with that. I disagree, but the problem is the word that it's a gap between verse 1 and verse 2. Verse 1, in the beginning was the word. No, sorry, that's John 1:1. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, and the earth was without form and void. Now, they want to say that the word we translate was should actually mean became. Now, every translation translates this word as was almost 100%, minus a few things where it's like that doesn't really work here and there's context, and so you have to make a very big effort to say was. Was has to be became here. You have to prove the context requires that. Some people trying to say, well, because it's the world, the earth was without form and void, and there was darkness, but that there was something wrong with it. But of course, Isaiah, and don't ask me to quote it because I can't remember, but Isaiah says God created darkness. So there's nothing out of the ordinary because he made darkness. So yes, I don't think it would be a very difficult time to convince me that the grammar dictates that it has to be became here, and that it isn't more likely was. The final view is the one I hold, which is the literal account. Oh, right. The other thing is that with the gap theory, he made a whole bunch of stuff and then it was all destroyed in a giant calamity, and then you have the other stuff. But in Exodus, I believe, Moses wrote, in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the seas and all that in them is. Now, that sounds a lot to me like everything that God made, he made in that 6-day period. Doesn't really leave room for, well, he made some stuff and then he broke it and then he fixed it later. So yes, the literal view is God made the heavens and the earth. He created everything in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. It's a fairly simple reading of the text, supported by the verse I quoted earlier. The only thing that you have to contend with is modern interpretations of science, of archaeological evidence. Now, there are plenty of brilliant young Earth scientists out there who hold to a literal 6-day creation, right? And well, we kind of have to if you're a young Earth creationist anyway, but that's the point. Go to places like creation.com, Answers in Genesis. They're full of young Earth creationists who are scientists. They went to their colleges and they came to these conclusions, and they have arguments defending it. So if you read it and you're not trying to, you're not trying to mesh what men believe the world was like today, right? What men believe today with what Scripture says, what Scripture has always said. When you're not trying to merge them together, you'll come out with a literal interpretation. Almost always. So yes, that about covers it. This is my longest video yet, and I'm going to come out and say, I don't think I'm going to be doing Genesis videos all the way through. I think what I will most likely be doing instead is having a playlist where I will having 66 playlists with videos for each book in it, and maybe some playlists for different topics. That way, when I find a topic that's interesting, I don't have to wait. So, will you see more Genesis videos soon? Probably, but I won't necessarily be doing it in order. So, yes, that's it for me. I will see you next time. Goodbye.